Cool. So hopefully we've finished off the person class now. We've got a bunch of new stuff going on in here, right? So we should have like a add phone method and a print details method and stuff. What we're going to do now is go on and have a look at building a second class. So far we've got like this person class that we've built. And what we want to do is we want to add a new class, which is an address book. And this is going to store all of the people that we make. Okay. So let's go through this process and work out like what do we need it to do, right? So we're going to have an address book class, and let's look at some tasks that we need. So first of all, the constructor, well, that's pretty simple because the way that I think we want it to work, we don't really need to worry about constructor. What we actually want it to do is basically work like this. So we can set up a new person, say person 1. How do we do this? Joe, and then what was it? Surname, and then a date of birth. And then we've got that new person. What we want to be able to do, and this is like the new stuff we need to write, we want to be able to make an address book. Or let's call it book, right? And we don't need to give anything to constructor for this, so we want to be able to set that up. And then what we basically want to be able to do is we want to be able to call an add method on this book. So we want to be able to say something like book.add, and then we want to be able to pass into here our person that we created. Now I'm going to go back over this in a minute. We're going to write some tests and everything, but to give you an idea of what we want to make, we want to be able to pass that person into here, and then we want to be able to call book.entries, and we want to get back from it an array with all of these person objects. So in this case it would have just one person object, like in here. Okay, so this is like what we're building, and if you imagine this is like a class diagram, we've basically got one attribute, which is entries. So that's like an attribute property on it, and then we've got one method, an instance method, which is add, and that takes a person object. Okay, and we don't care about the return value for it. So that's what we're going to try and build now. So tasks wise, we need to create the class, and then we also need to set up this entries thing with like an initial value. So it needs to have an entries attribute, which should be an array. And then the second task that we've got is to add a add method, which takes a person object. Cool. So let's work through that then. Okay, let's start with this first thing. What we need to do is we need to create a test for this address book. Now we could go over into our person.testing and we could like add another describe thing down the bottom, but this file's called person.test.js, and if you had a really big project with loads of classes, we wouldn't want to put them all in one file. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to add a new file called AddressBook.test.js, and this is going to contain the tests for our address book, so we can keep them kind of separate. I'm just going to go and copy and paste this top stuff here, okay, getting chai in and all that, so that we can put it in our address book. And then I'm also going to copy and paste this first describe thing here and put that down here. And this wants to be address book. So now we need to start thinking about the tests we want. So we probably want to test it initializes properly. So let's just say it initializes properly. And then we want to basically, there's not much to do in here. We want to say something like book equals new address book. And then we want to just check that book.entries is a empty array, just like we did over in the person test, where we were checking that the thing here was an array. Okay, so we need to turn this into an expectation. Okay, so we need to say expect book.entries to deep equal an empty array. So if we run that now, we can see that all of our person tests are still passing, but we've got a failure here, right? Address book is not defined, which makes sense. So we need to define our address book. And we'll require that in. And we'll require a file that we haven't made yet. So that's going to be models. And then we should call that file, use the same naming convention. So we're going to call it addressbook.js. And if we try running that, we get this big gnarly error that we saw before because it can't find the file. So we need to go and make one. Ooh. Cool. Now while we're in here, I'm kind of, instead of going into like doing some more TDD and running the test again, we know that we need to create a class in here, right? So I might as well just do that now. Class addressbook. And then we know we need to export that. So we just want to module.exports addressbook. And hopefully now if we run the tests, we get a failure saying that we expected undefined, and actually it was, we were expecting an empty array. So we need a constructor in here which sets up an empty array. So we need to name this right. So in our test, if we have a look at the test, we expected it to be called entries. That's the property we need. So we need to say this.entries equals an empty array. And we've got a green test for it initializing properly. So the next thing we need to do in our test is go back and implement this add method. So we should write a test for that. And this needs a bit more setup. If you think about the four-phase testing, right? We'd set up, actually execute the thing, verify it worked correctly. In this test, the only setup is creating the address book. Okay, in fact, that's also, in this case, that's also the action that we're trying to verify, right? But in this, we need a bit more setup. So we're going to say it can add people to the book. And then inside the test, we need to do some stuff. So first of all, we need to create an address book, so we've got somewhere to put them. And what we want to do down here somewhere is we want to basically be able to the thing we're testing, we want to be able to say book.add. And then we want to give it like a person in here, yeah, like an actual person object. And then we need to do some sort of expectation afterwards, right? But we haven't actually got any person objects here at the moment. So we need to create a person object. So let's just create one called person1, which we know how to do with new person. This is the thing we did earlier. And let's make it Joe Blogs. So we're creating a new person, and then what we can do is we can pass that new person into here. Okay. And if you just run this test, in fact, let's not run it yet actually because we haven't got an expectation. Let's write like a simple expectation. So let's say that we expect book.entries, and this is going to return the array book.entries. And just for a simple test to begin with, let's just say we expect book.entries.length to equal, can you guess what it should equal? Like 1, right? Because we've put one person into it. And hopefully if we run this, we'll get an interesting failure. So it says here, person is not defined. Okay. And that's because we're trying to create a new person here. But in our test, in our address book test, we don't have any way of actually creating people because we don't have this person class available in here. So what we need to do is we need to bring that in the same way that we did in the person test. Okay. So not only are we bringing in the address book, but because this test relies on being able to create a person inside the test, we've also got to require in the person class that we wrote. And now we've got an error which is kind of more like what we wanted. We've got book.add is not a function, which makes sense. So if we head over to our address book and add a function here called add, and we know that wants to take a person. And then a bit like we did with the other, bit like we did with the emails and the phone numbers, we just need to say this.entries .push, and we're going to push that person into the entries, and hopefully we'll get some green tests. Cool. So this implementation kind of works, right? It meets our criteria at the moment, but it doesn't actually confirm that like this person is the thing that got put in here. So one of the things that we could do is we could leave this assertion saying that we expect it to now have one entry in the phone book, but we could also come down here and ask like, well, what should that first entry be? Okay, so this is going to get the first thing in the entries array, and if we wanted to say compare on first name, we could actually compare the first name to whatever we're asserting against here. So we could say get the first entry in the address book and then look for its first name and expect that to equal Joe. And so we've got kind of two expectations testing what's going on. Now there's a bit of an argument for not doing this because this introduces like a dependency on the person class, in that if we change on our person class, we change the attribute from first name to forename, this test will start breaking. But it's probably cool for now, right? So let's just run those, make sure it still works. Cool. So this might seem a little bit weird, this idea of passing in a person object. So let's talk about that for a minute. So it can sometimes be kind of weird when we first start looking at putting stuff that aren't strings or numbers into arrays. And so far we've only looked at putting strings and numbers and things like that in arrays. So if we have a look at this, we've got a kind of entries array down here. And we're used to seeing stuff like this, entries.push1, and that's going to put the string 1 in the first box of the array. And if we do entries.push2, it'll put the string 2 in the second box, and the same with the string 3. Only now we've got a kind of different situation, because we've got this person class, which is like a factory for building new objects. So when we say p1 equals new person and give it some details to the constructor, that's going to make a new instance from that factory class. Okay, it's going to make a new person who's got the first name Danny and the surname Smith, and that's an object of type person. And then if we call p2 equals a new person and give it Angie's details, we get another instance of the person class. And what this means is that if we now do entries.push and we pass in that first person object, it's not going to put a string or an integer or something in that first box. It's actually going to move the object, the Danny Smith object, in there. And if we do entries.push p2, it's going to move Angeli into the second box. And what this means is that if we write something like this, in other words, we go and get the first bit of, or the first item in that array, that's going to return an actual person object. And because it's an actual person object, it has methods available on it, and it has attributes on it like .firstname. So if we run this line, it's going to return Angeli's name.